Christ Jesus. We might also notice verse 19, and my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in grace by Christ Jesus. So thinking about being prepared for something, Jesus is not saying, oh, listen, just trust in God. When you go take that test, don't bother to study for it. No, there's a difference between being prepared for something and worrying about something. Yes, there are most things we need to be prepared for. We need to think about things in advance, if possible, and be prepared for a good response to those things. But we should not let worry make us anxious, because we can't do anything about most of the things that are going to happen. It's a matter of trust in God. And it's a matter of having little faith sometimes. So do the best that you can. Be as prepared as you can be. And then let everything, let God take care of the rest. Now, a second type of wrong thinking is selfish thinking. A few weeks ago, we talked about the kind of thinking we ought to have in that regard. We ought to be asking ourselves questions such as, how will my behavior, how will my course of action affect God? How will it affect my brothers and sisters? How will it affect the church at large? And so we need to be thinking about others as we live. Let's notice Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit. It's sad, but sometimes we see those attitudes in the Lord's church. But we ought to be sure that we don't possess them ourselves. Now, dealing with someone else who has those problems, that's another matter. But if each one of us would take care of ourselves, we would be in good shape. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. And then also from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 24, a thought that echoes that. Let no one seek his own, but each one another's well-being. Now we come to the third category, and we're going to call this miscalculations or jumping to conclusions. Now, as we go through this, you may think of some additional examples. If you do, please write them down. It might collect all of these into an article. I got 10, but there's probably many more that I've not thought of. So let's begin with people drawing the wrong conclusions. And we go to Genesis chapter 20 and verse 8. This is the wrong kind of thinking, jumping to conclusions. Remember, Jesus said, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. And all too often, people draw conclusions too quickly. So Genesis chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. See, let me turn one more page before I finish that. So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all of his servants, and told him all these things in their hearing, and the men were very afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham and said, what have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done. Then Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you have in view that you have done this thing? And Abraham said, because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. Remember, Abimelech had taken her, and God had threatened to kill him. But he wants to know, why have you done this to us? Well, I thought there's no fear of God in this place. Miscalculation. This man and his people were more honorable than Abraham gave him credit for. We should not make decisions based on things that have not happened. Let's take another one. And this one, of all the ones we're going to look at, is a little bit understandable. Genesis chapter 38, beginning with looking at verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, because she had covered her face. Well, he assumed that this woman was a harlot. She was not. She was his daughter-in-law. But he assumed that she was a harlot because she was dressed like one. Don't always jump to conclusions by the way someone is dressed. As I've mentioned before, one of the young men in a congregation in Illinois said something to one of the young ladies, and her father came up to him after worship and said, "Did you say that my daughter looked like a harlot?" And he said, "No, I did not. I said she just dresses like one." Well, she had. He was being honest. Maybe not very tactful, but honest. But she was dressing like one. And if you dress like one, that's what people are going to think. Now, Tamar did it on purpose. She was not accidentally looking like one. She had a purpose of her own in mind. But he did jump to a conclusion that he should have thought over. And in fact, he shouldn't have been willing to be with a harlot anyway. Number 3 is Jacob in Genesis chapter 37. And this involves the fact that they wanted to convince his father that Joseph had perished. And so they went to Jacob in verse 32. Well, actually, they sent the tunic of many colors, Genesis 37:32, and they brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not?" Well, there wasn't any other one like it. He would obviously identify it as Joseph's. And he recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Of course, it never entered his mind that his sons had sold him into slavery and ripped up this and dipped it in blood. He never imagined that for a moment. So he tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his waist and mourned for his son many days. And all of his sons did all that they could to comfort him. Is that hypocritical? Here they are trying to comfort him for something that hasn't happened. But they presented him evidence so that he would conclude that it had happened. But he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. I don't know how you allow that to continue, but they did. And later on, when they brought word that Joseph was alive, he refused to believe it, because he knew he was dead. Or at least he thought he knew that. But that's the way sometimes that people are deceived. There was no investigation, and I don't know what he would have done to prove otherwise. He took their word for it. Now, we want to consider also, in connection with this, Israel saying to Joseph later on in Genesis 48, verse 11, "I had not thought to see your face, but in fact, God has also shown me your offspring." So this, he did live many, many years with the impression that Joseph had died, but he had not. Well, let's go to Joshua chapter 22, verses 11 and 12. Joshua chapter 22, verses 11 and 12. This concerns after the conquering of the land and the splitting of the land. Something happened that they didn't quite know how to take, but they jumped to conclusion.